I'm Brianna. I'm 18 now, and the last 2 years of my life were a nightmare. At first, my dad made me so irritated that I wanted him to die. Then I almost caused a stroke. And when my mom found out about it, she kinda kicked me out of the house. Almost 2 years ago, my dad injured his spine and became wheelchair bound. This made him angry at the whole world. And since my mom and I were the only people he had nearby, he vented his anger at us. He used to be the only breadwinner, and he just kept saying that if he didn't need to work that hard, everything would be okay. Our reality was that we didn't have enough money. I had a few months of school to go, so Mom had to find a job for herself to provide a living for us. I bet, for her, having a husband like this was awful. But she was very patient, unlike me. I was so tired of everything. So I often complained that my dad, for example, in his regular fit of anger, broke another plate. But she would stop me, saying that I had to be grateful that my dad was still alive after all. Honestly, back then I didn't think that it was good at all to live like he was living, torturing me and my mom. Of course I couldn't tell anybody that I wish my dad was dead. So at some point I started keeping a diary where I wrote about everything. And that made me feel a little better. Anyway, one evening, I was getting ready to go to a party that was organized by one of my classmates. I was looking forward to meeting a guy named Rob there, who I really liked a lot. So I was sitting in front of the mirror, curling my hair. I was so excited, anticipating how I was going to walk there, looking so beautiful in my favorite dress, when suddenly my mom entered my room with some bad news. It turned out that she urgently needed to go to work. Well, I had to stay with my dad, in case he needed something. I think, at that moment, I had the strongest feelings of unfairness that I had had in my whole life. Mom began getting ready for work, while I was running after her around the house, trying to convince her to let me go to that party, at least for an hour. But she was adamant. You can be sure that right when the door closed after my mom, my dad called me to come up to him. He asked me to make him a sandwich, and as soon as he saw my unfinished hair and makeup, he started laughing at me. I bet that he was totally proud of the fact that he managed to ruin my could-have-been awesome night. Later that night, my friend Kathy began sending me photos of her at that party, texting me about how badly she missed me there. And I heard that Rob had already come and was all alone. So I made up my mind that I couldn't miss my chance with him just like that. My dad was already sleeping, so I thought that it wouldn't hurt anybody if I just went to the party secretly for one single hour, and then get back home in time so that neither my dad nor my mom would find out what I did. Oh, I felt like a movie star in my dress, and everybody was giving me compliments, and that inspired me even more to go up to Rob and start talking to him. I didn't even notice how we had begun flirting with each other. And then at some point, he took my hand and suggested we go find a quieter place. Anyway, we were in the middle of kissing when my cell phone rang. It was my dad calling, but I immediately switched my cell off. I'd been dreaming about that kiss for a whole year, so nothing was going to spoil it. After 30 minutes later, I decided that I could no longer stay at that party. I rushed home as fast as I could. I already had a plan to say that I was taking a bath in my headphone and didn't hear how my cell phone rang. Luckily, that party was only a couple of blocks away from my home. I snuck into the house as silently as I could and rushed into my room first. I took off my dress and got back into my home clothes, removed my makeup with wet wipes as fast as I could, and only then did I go check on my dad. Suddenly, the entrance door swept open, and my mom rushed inside. She was out of breath and terribly worried. It turned out that my dad called her and said that he couldn't reach me, and that he didn't feel so good. So my mom had to urgently come home and check on him. I began giving her my excuses, but as soon as my mom entered my dad's bedroom, she almost hysterically yelled at me to call 911. In the next few minutes, the paramedics arrived and turmoil began, and they took my dad away in an ambulance. Of course my mom went with them. They left, and I just stood in the hall, looking through the open entrance door. I had a single thought in my head, which scared me to death. What if my dad couldn't make it this time? Later that night, I couldn't fall asleep, and I had nobody to talk to. So I just wrote down in my diary everything that I was thinking about. My dad was discharged from the hospital with a speech impairment. It was a complication after the stroke that he had. Now that he had a new disability, Dad's mood got 1,000 times worse. And Mom was practically the only person he could stand. Whenever he saw me, for example, when I would pass by his room, he would throw his pillow or something else at me. I guess he blamed me for not picking up the phone that night. My school had almost ended by that time, so my mom and I agreed that it would be better if I started working too, so that she could work from home for several hours a week and devote almost all her time to looking after my dad. Of course, being a cashier at the grocery store was far from what I'd been dreaming about, but it was still better than staying at home with my sick dad. One day I came home and found Mom sitting at the kitchen table with this absent look on her face. My diary was lying in front of her. It was obvious that she had read it. I decided that my best defense was a good offense. So I resentfully asked why my mom was going through my things. But she only showed me that page, where I wrote about the party thing. I flew into a rage so quickly that I didn't notice how I had started talking about my dad's attitude towards me. That it made me sick. And that because of him, I didn't have my own life at all. Mom just silently listened to my tirade. And when I had finished, she sighed heavily and said that since it was so hard for me to live in my parents' house, she only saw one solution, and that was for me to move out of their house. The whole situation was so insulting that I simply went to my room and packed my stuff. I didn't even say goodbye to my mom and dad, and I just left the house. I decided to go back to work. There was a box room there with a couch, and I thought it'd be fine staying there for a couple of nights, till I figured something else out. I didn't have enough money to rent a room on my own, and I apparently didn't want to bother any of my friends with the details of why my mom kicked me out of the house. Frankly speaking, somewhere deep inside, I was hoping that my mom would change her mind and call me to ask me to come back, but I hadn't even heard a peep from her a week later, and that made me even angrier with her, so I didn't call her either. Then the store guard began hinting that I could no longer stay there. Otherwise, he might have problems with the boss. So I took all the available shifts possible to be able to save up as much money as I could, to find myself a place to live. I was already completely desperate when I just so happened to accidentally run into Rob. Yeah, that guy from the party. He called me a few times during this whole time, but because of all that had happened, I never called him back. He took me out to have lunch, and I don't know, I was probably already too tired from my bad luck. Or I just needed someone to feel pity for me. But when he asked me how I was doing, I just burst into tears. I was hoping for nothing when I told him about my mishaps. But imagine my surprise when later that day, he texted me an address and said that there was a room for me to stay in for as long as I wanted. And for a price that I could afford. It turns out that Rob's granny had a friend, a single old lady. God bless her, who had a spare room for me. So by supper time, I was already drinking tea and getting acquainted with Mrs. Gabrielle. It was a bit awkward to be living with a total stranger, but she was very nice to me. But after 2 weeks of staying there, I discovered that by arranging that meeting for me with Mrs. Gabrielle, Rob, who had become my boyfriend, really ended up saving me. One evening, I was walking by Mrs. Gabrielle's room and heard her sobbing. I decided to ask if everything was okay with her, and found her looking through an old photo album. She told me that that day would have been the birthday of her husband, who had passed away 10 years ago, and who she missed badly. But what's more, I found out that during the last 10 years of his life, he was totally blind, and she had to nurse him like a baby, and that even though it was extremely hard for her, she'd prefer to have him blind or ill and nearby, rather than not have him at all. That made me think about my parents. The whole night I was lying in bed, trying to imagine how hard it was for my mom to be with Dad all alone. I mean, without my help. And in the morning, filled with decidedness, I knocked on the door of my parents' house. I won't bother you with the details about how I was apologizing, and how Mom and I were hugging and sobbing our socks off. All I can say now is that I am back home, and even though my dad is still gloomy and annoying and doesn't want to talk to me, I know that I am here for my mom.